I didn't think a letter written 2 years ago could end my relationship overnight. I didn't think my life would start falling apart because of a piece of paper hidden behind a bookshelf. I'm 29 years old, and until yesterday, I thought I was in a stable, adult relationship. We weren't perfect, but who is? I believed conflict was normal. Compromise was normal. Arguments were just part of living together. I was wrong. My boyfriend Ethan found a letter my ex-boyfriend had written 2 years ago. A letter meant for him, for the man who came after. By the time I got home from work, Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, eyes red, shoulders tense, the letter spread open in front of him like evidence in a trial. Tissues everywhere. Silence so thick it felt deliberate. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He just asked me to sit down. The first line of the letter was brutal. To the man dating Claire next, I hope you read this before it's too late. Andrew, my ex, had written 3 full pages detailing exactly how I treated him, how I dismissed his concerns, how I promised to change and didn't, how I slowly shifted responsibility onto him until he doubted whether his needs were even reasonable. My instinct was immediate and defensive. I laughed. I scoffed. I told Ethan Andrew was bitter, dramatic, manipulative. I said the letter was pathetic. I said Andrew was trying to sabotage my future. I said it proved nothing. But Ethan didn't argue back. Instead, he started asking questions. Quiet ones. Specific ones. Why did the examples in the letter sound familiar? Why did Andrew predict, almost word for word, how I would react to being confronted? Why did Ethan recognize himself in the descriptions? That's when the air changed. Ethan started listing moments from our relationship. Conversations I thought were minor. Arguments I believed I'd won. Times I told him he was overreacting. Times I made him feel like the problem for wanting consistency, accountability, or follow-through. I felt cornered, misunderstood, attacked. But underneath all of that was something worse. A creeping realization that this wasn't the first time someone had said these things about me. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't a coincidence. Ethan packed a bag that night. He said he needed space. He said he needed time. He said he wasn't sure anymore. And I was left alone in the apartment, staring at a letter I had never meant for anyone to read, wondering if the problem in all my relationships had been standing in the mirror the entire time. I keep replaying the moment Ethan held the letter up between us, like it was something toxic he didn't want to touch with his bare hands. Not because the paper itself mattered, because of what it did to him, because of what it pulled into the light. Ethan and I had been together for 8 months. It wasn't some whirlwind fling. It felt steady. He's the kind of man who colors inside the lines, organized, patient, the type who reads the syllabus on the first day and highlights it. He's in graduate school for psychology, drowning in textbooks and case studies, always half thinking about theories, even when we're just watching TV. When we met, I liked that about him. I work full-time, and I'm not the kind of woman who writes poetry about feelings. I show love by being present, by paying bills on time, by doing what needs to be done without making a big deal out of it. So when Ethan's lease ended 3 months ago, moving in together felt like the obvious next step. Practical, logical, like building a real life. At first it was good. We made rules. Split chores. Rotate cooking. Keep the space calm because he needed to study. I even said, very confidently, that I wasn't like other people he'd dated. I wasn't messy. I wasn't chaotic. I didn't play games. I believe that. And the truth is, I wasn't lying on purpose. It's just that my version of equal has always been flexible. If I worked late, I believed it was fair to let the dishes sit. If Ethan noticed them first, I believed it wasn't a big deal if he handled it. If he reminded me, I'd do it eventually. And because I did do it sometimes, I told myself I was pulling my weight. That's what made it so hard to hear Ethan describe the same slow drift Andrew had described. Because nothing in my mind felt like a single dramatic betrayal. It felt like normal life. Ethan is careful with the language. He never explodes. Even when he's hurt, he tries to keep his voice level, like he's afraid raising it will make him the bad guy. He brought things up gently at first, little conversations that always started with, "Hey, can we talk about something?" And I remember how I responded. I remember sighing, rolling my eyes without thinking, saying, "You're making this a bigger deal than it is," or worse, trying to sound calm and reasonable while making him feel ridiculous. "Ethan, your standards are just higher than mine." It sounded so logical coming out of my mouth, like a neutral fact. But I can see now how it landed. Like his discomfort wasn't a real issue, just a personality flaw he needed to manage on his own. The letter brought all of that rushing back. Ethan had found it while reorganizing the bookshelf to make room for his textbooks. The envelope was tucked behind a row of old books I hadn't touched in years, my name written on the front in Andrew's handwriting. I hadn't even known it was there. That part alone should have rattled me. The idea that something from my past had been living in my space for 2 years and I never noticed. It said something about me, about how little attention I pay to the small things that other people end up carrying. Andrew and I dated for a year and a half. We broke up 2 years ago, and it wasn't clean. He moved out suddenly while I was at work. When I came home, half the apartment was empty, and there was a short note. I can't do this anymore. No long conversation, no big closure, just gone. At the time, I told myself it proved Andrew was dramatic, unstable, not committed to fixing problems. But now, sitting alone in the quiet after Ethan left, I can't stop wondering if Andrew left because talking to me had become pointless. Because maybe every time he tried, I found a way to make him feel like he was asking for too much. And Ethan, he read Andrew's words and saw a map. A warning. And he realized he'd been walking into the same pattern, one I didn't even know I was creating. The apartment felt different the morning after Ethan left. Not emptier, quieter in a way that made everything echo. Every sound felt louder, the hum of the fridge, the tick of the clock, my own footsteps moving through rooms that suddenly felt too open. I told myself he just needed time. That's what he'd said, after all. But the truth was, the moment he walked out with that bag slung over his shoulder, something fragile cracked between us, and I felt it in my chest, like the delayed pain after a fall. I tried to distract myself by replaying our relationship the way I'd always done before, filtering it through my own logic. I wasn't cruel, I didn't cheat, I didn't lie, I didn't yell. How bad could it really be? But the letter had planted something I couldn't shake. I kept thinking about how precise Andrew had been. Not dramatic, not vague, just accurate. He hadn't accused me of being evil. He hadn't called me abusive. He'd described patterns, small ones, that added up over time. And that's what scared me, because patterns are harder to deny than single mistakes. As the day went on, my phone buzzed with messages from Ethan. Short, polite, careful. I'm staying with my friend Sarah for a few days. I just need space to think. This isn't an automatic breakup. Each message was measured, like he was already practicing emotional distance. I typed out responses and erased them. Apologies that felt hollow. Explanations that sounded too much like the ones Andrew had warned about. By afternoon, I did something I hadn't planned on doing. I started rereading the letter, alone, without trying to argue with it. Andrew had written about how things shifted once we moved in together, how he became the one reminding me about chores, about bills, about commitments I'd agreed to, and then forgot. He wrote about how every reminder somehow turned into a conversation about his tone, his timing, his expectations. And I hated how much I recognized myself in that. Because I do hate feeling managed. I hate being told what to do. And somewhere along the way, I decided that anyone asking me to follow through was trying to control me. The seed of conflict wasn't the letter itself. It was the way Ethan started connecting dots. That night he called me, not to fight, not to accuse, to ask questions. He wanted to understand. He asked why. When he brought things up, I always jumped straight to defending myself instead of listening. He asked why I seemed more focused on proving I wasn't wrong than on understanding how he felt. He asked why I framed compromise like a loss. I felt my chest tighten, because I didn't have good answers. I told him I was tired, that work had been stressful, that relationships required flexibility. He listened. Then he said something that stayed with me. I've been telling myself I'm just sensitive, he said quietly. But reading that letter made me realize I've been shrinking myself to avoid conflict with you. Shrinking. The word landed like a bruise. He told me that after reading Andrew's letter, he started listing moments from our own relationship. Moments he'd brushed off. Things he'd normalized. The list was longer than he'd expected. I wanted to argue. I wanted to say the letter had poisoned him. But instead, I heard my own voice from the night before, calling Andrew dramatic, manipulative, unstable. And suddenly, I saw the pattern Andrew had warned about in real time. I was doing it again. The conflict wasn't explosive. It was quiet. It lived in pauses, in unanswered questions, in Ethan's voice becoming more careful with me. And somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't just about him deciding whether to stay. It was about whether I could actually hear what two different men, years apart, had tried to tell me. The moment everything truly tipped wasn't when Ethan left. It was when he came back to talk. We met 3 days later at a small cafe near my office, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and low music that forces you to lean in if you want to be heard. I arrived early, ordered a coffee I didn't really want, and spent 10 minutes rehearsing what I thought was the right tone to use. Calm, open, reasonable. I told myself I was ready to listen. Ethan walked in looking exhausted. Not angry, just worn down, like someone who'd been thinking too hard for too long. He didn't hug me. He sat across from me and wrapped both hands around his cup like he needed the warmth. He asked if I'd read the letter again. I said yes. He nodded, like he expected that. Then he pulled out his phone and set it face down on the table, a small but deliberate gesture. Full attention. No distractions. I need to talk about something, he said, and I need you to just hear me. Not fix it. Not explain it away. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the instinct to brace myself. He started slowly. He told me that after finding the letter, he'd gone back through conversations we'd had over the last few months. He'd replayed arguments in his head. He'd written down examples, just like Andrew had done. That part made my jaw clench. Ethan noticed. He paused, then continued anyway. He brought up the bathroom cleaning schedule, the one we'd agreed on. How I'd missed my turn twice in a row. How when he mentioned it, I told him he was being inflexible and that his standards were higher than mine. He talked about the dishes, about how I'd agreed to be more consistent, then snapped when he reminded me, calling it nagging. Then he said something I hadn't expected. I don't feel like your partner when that happens, he said. I feel like your employee, or your parent. The words hit hard. I opened my mouth to argue. I wanted to say he was exaggerating, but he wasn't done. He told me how he'd started second-guessing himself before bringing things up, how he'd ask himself whether something was worth the emotional cost of another conversation where he'd end up feeling like he was asking for too much. He told me he'd talked to his older sister about it, how she'd asked him pointed questions about whether I ever took responsibility without being prompted, whether I ever apologized without attaching a justification. And then came the moment that split something open. I talked to Andrew, Ethan said quietly. I stared at him. He explained that he'd reached out through mutual friends, that they'd spoken for over an hour, that Andrew hadn't ranted or gloated. He'd just confirmed things, expanded on them, given examples Ethan recognized immediately. I felt my face heat. That's completely inappropriate, I said. My voice was sharper than I meant it to be. You went behind my back. Ethan didn't raise his voice. I went looking for clarity, he said, because I didn't want to end up doubting my own reality. There it was. That phrase again. My reality. Andrew had written about that exact feeling, about doubting himself, about wondering whether he was too sensitive. I could feel myself slipping into familiar territory, defensive, cornered. I told Ethan Andrew had always been insecure, that he'd taken things personally, that talking to him wasn't fair. Ethan watched me carefully. Do you hear yourself right now? He asked. I froze. He told me that the most disturbing part of the letter wasn't the chores or the arguments. It was how accurately Andrew had predicted my reactions, how I'd dismiss him, how I'd reframe the issue so the focus shifted away from my behavior. Ethan said something then that made my stomach drop. I don't think you're doing this on purpose, he said, but intention doesn't erase impact. Silence stretched between us. For the first time, I didn't know how to redirect the conversation. I couldn't blame stress, or timing, or communication styles. This wasn't about a single fight. It was about a pattern I had never questioned because it worked for me. Ethan leaned back in his chair. I'm not breaking up with you today, he said, but I can't keep living like this. I need to know if you're actually willing to change or if you just want me to accept this version of you. I didn't answer right away because for the first time, I realized something terrifying. I didn't know whether I was capable of changing the thing they were describing. After the cafe, I walked for nearly an hour without realizing where I was going. The city moved around me. Cars, people, conversations bleeding into one another. But I felt disconnected, like I was observing everything through glass. Ethan's words kept replaying in my head, looping in ways I couldn't shut off. Intention doesn't erase impact. I'd always believed being well-intentioned was enough. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I didn't wake up planning to dismiss someone I loved. In my mind, that mattered. But now, for the first time, I had to sit with the possibility that my intentions had never protected anyone but me. When I got home, the apartment felt unfamiliar. I noticed things I'd never really looked at before. A coffee mug I thought was mine, but wasn't. A paperback tucked behind the couch. A hair tie in the bathroom drawer that clearly didn't belong to me. Andrew's things. They'd been here for 2 years, untouched, unnoticed. The realization made my chest tighten. Not because of nostalgia, but because it mirrored everything he'd written about. how I moved through shared spaces without really seeing them, how other people adjusted around me while I remained convinced nothing was wrong. I sat on the floor and read the letter again. This time I didn't skim. I didn't argue with it in my head. I let it land. Andrew had written about moments I barely remembered, small conversations that had stuck with him for months, promises I'd made casually, then forgotten, how I'd always sounded reasonable, calm, logical, while slowly shifting the emotional weight back onto him. He'd written about how exhausting it was to feel like every concern had to be defended like a court case. I saw myself in every line, not as a villain, as someone who believed being right mattered more than being connected. The shame came in waves, not dramatic, tearful shame, the quiet kind, the kind that settles into your bones and makes you want to look away from yourself. I texted Ethan that night. "I'm sorry I got defensive. I'm trying to understand." He responded an hour later. "I appreciate that. I still need time." That was it. No reassurance. No soft landing. Just space. The next morning, I woke up with the familiar urge to fix everything quickly, to prove I was changing, to show effort. But Ethan had been clear. Words weren't enough. So I started with something small. I cleaned the apartment, not halfway, not distracted. I did the dishes, the laundry, the bathroom, all of it. And I didn't tell anyone about it. The silence afterward was uncomfortable, because without someone there to notice, I realized how much validation I'd been expecting for doing the bare minimum. That realization stung. Later that afternoon, Ethan called. He sounded tired, but calm. He said he wasn't ending the relationship yet, but he needed distance while he decided what he wanted. He told me he'd noticed patterns in himself too, how he'd been accommodating, minimizing, absorbing discomfort to keep the peace. He said reading Andrew's letter helped him recognize that pattern. That hurt more than anything else. Not because Andrew was right, but because Ethan was becoming stronger by seeing it. And I was only just beginning to. We agreed on something structured, clear, measurable. For the next month, I would manage household responsibilities completely on my own, without reminders, without excuses. We'd have weekly check-ins where he'd tell me honestly how I was showing up in conversations. No deflecting. No explaining why I was right. If I couldn't do that, we'd be done. After the call, I sat alone for a long time. I realized something then that scared me more than losing Ethan. I didn't know who I was without my defenses. They'd protected me for so long, made me feel competent, in control, safe. But they were also the reason two people I loved had felt unheard. The question wasn't whether I could change for Ethan. It was whether I was willing to face the parts of myself I'd been avoiding my entire adult life. Because if I couldn't, this wouldn't be the last letter. The first week, I thought I was doing great. I followed the schedule I'd made for myself like it was a contract. Dishes done the same day. Laundry folded, not left in piles. Trash taken out before it overflowed. I even cleaned the fridge, something I'd always put off because it felt unnecessary until someone else pointed it out. I told myself this was proof. Proof that Andrew had exaggerated. Proof that Ethan just hadn't waited long enough to see real change. But during our first weekly check-in, Ethan said something that shifted the ground under me. "You keep listing what you've done," he said gently, "and I don't know what to do with that." I laughed a little too quickly. "Isn't that the point?" He shook his head. "Doing the work isn't the favor, it's the baseline." That word again. Baseline. I felt irritation flare in my chest. I'd spent the entire week being careful, deliberate, conscious, and somehow it still wasn't enough. Ethan explained that he could feel me waiting for acknowledgement, that it made him uncomfortable, like he was being asked to reward me for behavior that should have been automatic. I told myself I could handle that feedback. But by the second week, the cracks started showing. Work got busy. I stayed late one night and left dishes in the sink, telling myself I'd handle them in the morning. I didn't. By the time I remembered, the day had already gotten away from me. When Ethan mentioned it during our check-in, something in me snapped. Not outwardly, internally. I felt that familiar surge of justification rise up before I could stop it. I started explaining how exhausted I'd been, how unrealistic it was to expect perfection, how 4 weeks wasn't enough time to change habits formed over years. Ethan let me talk. Then he said calmly, "You're doing it again." I felt my stomach drop. He wasn't angry. He wasn't accusing. He was observing. And that was worse. He told me the problem wasn't the missed dishes. It was how quickly I moved into defending myself instead of acknowledging the pattern. "I don't need you to be perfect," he said. "I need you to be accountable without making me feel like the enemy." By the third week, the effort felt heavier. I was aware of myself constantly, monitoring my tone, my reactions, my words. It was exhausting in a way I hadn't expected. And that exhaustion turned into resentment. Why did everything feel like it was under a microscope? Why did I feel like I was being graded? Those thoughts crept in quietly, insidiously. During our third check-in, Ethan said he could hear defensiveness in my voice again. He said it sounded like I was treating this month like a test to pass, rather than a shift in how I understood partnership. That hit harder than any accusation. Because it was true. I was performing change, not embodying it. I realized then that Andrew had probably seen this version of me too, the one who promised improvement, delivered just enough to calm the situation, and slowly slid back once the urgency passed. The escalation didn't come from yelling or dramatic fights. It came from repetition, from me catching myself too late, from Ethan growing quieter, from the space between us becoming something solid. During the fourth week, I slipped again. Nothing huge, just a tone, a sigh, can we not do this right now? Ethan didn't argue. He just closed his eyes for a moment, like someone accepting an answer they'd already known. At our final check-in, he didn't sit down right away. He paced. Then he told me he'd made his decision. He said he loved me. That part hurt more than anything else. He said he didn't doubt my intelligence, my competence, or my intentions. But he didn't trust that the patterns Andrew described wouldn't resurface once the pressure was gone. He said he couldn't build a future with someone who treated feedback like criticism and accountability like control. I wanted to argue. To say 4 weeks wasn't fair. To say change takes time. But even as the words formed, I recognized them. They were the same ones I'd used before. And this time I stopped myself. Ethan gathered the rest of his things a few days later. Polite, distant, final. Before he left, he asked me something unexpected. He asked if he could leave a letter for whoever I dated next. The request felt like a punch. I said no immediately, not because I was angry, because I was afraid. Afraid that if another person wrote the same things about me, I wouldn't be able to deny it anymore. After he left, the apartment felt unbearably quiet. Not lonely, exposed. And for the first time, I couldn't blame anyone else for how I'd ended up there. The lowest point didn't arrive with drama. It arrived in silence. After Ethan left for good, I stood in the middle of the apartment holding the doorframe, listening to the echo of his footsteps fade down the hall. No slammed doors, no final speech, just the soft click of the lock and the realization that I was alone, with nothing left to argue against. That night I didn't cry. I sat on the couch and stared at the wall until the light outside shifted from afternoon to evening. I kept expecting my phone to buzz, an angry text, a second thoughts message, something that would give me another chance to explain myself. Nothing came. I slept badly, woke up too early, lay there replaying conversations from the past decade, not just with Andrew and Ethan, but with friends, coworkers, even family members. Moments where someone had tried to tell me something, and I'd responded with logic instead of listening. I'd always thought that made me mature. Now it felt like a shield I'd hidden behind. The next few days blurred together. I went to work. I smiled when appropriate. I answered emails. On the outside, nothing had changed. On the inside, I felt hollowed out. I kept thinking about the letter Andrew wrote, the original one, how carefully he'd chosen his words, how he hadn't attacked my character, only my patterns, how he tried to warn someone else not out of revenge, but out of exhaustion. And then I thought about Ethan asking to leave a letter of his own. 2 men, years apart, same experience. That's when the weight of it really hit. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't choosing the wrong partners. This wasn't coincidence. This was me. I opened my laptop one night and reread old messages, texts I'd sent during arguments. I noticed how often I'd used phrases like, "You're taking this the wrong way. That's not what I meant. You're being too sensitive." Each one felt harmless on its own. Together they painted a picture I didn't like. I thought about reaching out to friends, but I didn't know what I'd say. "Hi, I think I might be the problem." In all my relationships didn't feel like a casual conversation starter. So I sat with the discomfort, with the shame, with the realization that being right had cost me intimacy. One evening, my sister asked me to help her move into a new apartment. I agreed without hesitation, eager to feel useful, to do something tangible. I showed up late. Not dramatically late, just enough to be inconsiderate. When she called me out on it, my instinct flared immediately. I started explaining traffic, work stress, poor planning on her part. She stopped me mid-sentence. "Why is it always someone else's job to manage your commitments?" she asked. The words landed hard. They sounded exactly like Ethan, exactly like Andrew. I stood there, surrounded by half-packed boxes, feeling something crack open inside me. For the first time, I didn't defend myself. I apologized. It felt strange, uncomfortable, like stepping into cold water, but also real. That moment didn't fix anything. It didn't bring Ethan back. It didn't erase the past. But it marked the point where I stopped pretending this was about one letter or one breakup. I was standing at the edge of a pattern I could no longer ignore, and I had to decide whether I was willing to do the slow, unglamorous work of changing, without anyone watching, without anyone promising to stay. Because if I didn't, the next woman I became would leave the same trail behind her, and someday someone else would find another letter. The shift didn't happen all at once. There was no sudden epiphany, no dramatic promise to be better. It started quietly, in moments where my old instincts rose up, and I chose, deliberately, not to follow them. After the incident with my sister, I started paying attention, not just to what people said to me, but to what happened inside my body when they said it. The tightness in my chest, the urge to explain, the reflex to correct. Those reactions had always felt automatic. I realized they weren't. They were habits, and habits could be interrupted. The first real test came at work. A coworker pointed out, politely, that I had a tendency to interrupt people during meetings. My initial thought was that I was being efficient, offering solutions. The familiar defense rose to my lips. I stopped. I took a breath. I didn't realize I was doing that, I said. Thanks for telling me. The moment passed. No argument, no damage control, no internal spiral. It felt strange. Later that day, I noticed how often I talked over people without meaning to. How often I assumed I understood their point before they finished explaining it. The realization was uncomfortable, but it was also clarifying. A few weeks later, something happened that felt like a true turning point. Andrew called me. I hadn't spoken to him since our breakup. Seeing his name on my screen made my stomach knot. I almost didn't answer, but I did. He didn't sound angry, or smug, or defensive. He sounded calm. He said Ethan had told him about the breakup. He said he wasn't calling to say, "I told you so." He just wanted to explain why he'd written the letter in the first place. We met for coffee the next day. It was awkward at first. Two people with shared history, now stripped of the story they used to tell about each other. Andrew told me the letter had started as notes to himself. He said he'd been questioning his own sanity toward the end of our relationship, wondering if he really was too demanding, too sensitive, too much. Writing things down helped him see patterns clearly. He said he'd left the letter because he didn't want anyone else to go through that same erosion of confidence. "I didn't hate you," he said. "I just felt invisible." That word lodged itself somewhere deep. Invisible. Andrew told me he was in a new relationship now, that it felt different. That conflict didn't leave him doubting himself. I listened. Really listened. For once, I didn't argue with his version of events. I didn't try to rewrite the past. I asked questions. Not to defend myself, but to understand. After we parted ways, I walked home slowly, letting the weight of that conversation settle. Two men, different relationships, same core experience. And now, finally, a third variable. Me actually hearing it. The turning point wasn't about winning anyone back. It was about realizing that self-awareness without accountability is just another form of avoidance. I stopped dating. Not dramatically, not out of guilt. I just chose not to bring someone else into my unfinished work. Instead, I focused on small, unremarkable changes, following through without being asked, apologizing without explanation, sitting with discomfort instead of redirecting it. Some days I slipped. When I did, I noticed it faster, corrected sooner. That mattered. I met Ethan once more, months later, by coincidence. We spoke briefly, politely. He said he could see a difference in how I communicated, even in that short exchange. He wasn't interested in trying again. And for the first time, that didn't feel like a failure. It felt like honesty. The power had shifted, not over him, but over myself. And that was something I'd never had before. The consequences didn't explode. They settled. They showed up in quiet realizations, in changed dynamics, in the absence of chaos where there used to be friction. The first fallout was social. People responded to me differently once I changed how I responded to them. Friends stopped bracing when they brought things up. Conversations felt less like negotiations and more like exchanges. I noticed that when I didn't immediately defend myself, people softened. They didn't need to sharpen their words to be heard. That alone told me how often they must have felt unheard before. The second fallout was internal. Without conflict to win, I had to sit with my own discomfort. There was no rush of justification anymore, no adrenaline from proving I was right, just the slow, steady work of responsibility. And responsibility, I learned, is quieter than ego. Ethan didn't come back. That was the hardest truth to accept, not because I thought I deserved another chance, but because I finally understood why he didn't give me one. Trust isn't rebuilt by intention. It's rebuilt by consistency. Andrew stayed out of my life, as he should have, but I heard through mutual friends that he was happy, grounded, that he felt seen in his relationship. Instead of resentment, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Relief that he'd named something I'd been running from. Relief that the pattern ended with me. My family noticed changes too. When my brother pointed out that I was late again, I apologized instead of explaining. When my mother commented on my tone, I adjusted instead of deflecting. No arguments, no power struggles, just acknowledgement. The biggest fallout wasn't what I lost. It was what stopped falling apart. I didn't need to control narratives anymore. People drew their own conclusions based on how I showed up. And for the first time, I trusted that process. One night, while reorganizing the bookshelf, the same one that started everything, I found the empty space where the letter had been. No envelope, no warning, no evidence. Just a gap. And I realized something profound. I didn't need to erase the past to move forward. I needed to stop repeating it. I thought about Ethan asking to leave a letter. I understood now why he'd wanted to. Not to punish me, to protect someone else. And maybe, in some way, to protect himself. The fallout wasn't dramatic revenge. It was distance, boundaries, people choosing peace over potential. And me, finally, respecting that. I didn't rebuild my life loudly. I rebuilt it quietly, with fewer explanations, with more listening, with no guarantees. And that was enough. There isn't a grand redemption scene at the end of this story. No reunion, no sweeping apology that fixes everything. No moment where the past is rewritten into something kinder. What there is clarity. Months later, my life looks quieter, simpler, not empty, just intentional. I still live alone. I still mess up sometimes. I still feel that old instinct rise when someone challenges me. The difference is, I notice it now. I pause. I choose differently. I learned that being articulate isn't the same as being accountable. That staying calm doesn't mean you're being fair. That you can hurt people deeply without ever raising your voice. I learned that two people can love you and still walk away, not because they didn't care, but because they cared enough about themselves. Andrew wasn't trying to ruin my future. Ethan wasn't being unfair. They were both responding to the same thing in me, something I had to see for myself before it could change. If there's a lesson here, it's this. Patterns don't announce themselves as problems. They feel like personality, like just how you are. Until someone stops absorbing the cost. I don't know who I'll date next. I don't know if I'll ever be the easiest person to love. But I do know this. I won't be the same person I was when that letter was written. And if the woman I become from here on out ever leaves someone behind, it won't be because she refused to listen. It will be because she finally learned how.